The soft hum of the fluorescent lights was the only sound in the prison library after hours, a stark contrast to the clanging, shouting symphony of the day. I preferred it this way. Silence was a canvas for precision. My gloved fingers, always gloved, traced the spines of the returned books, arranging them not just by call number, but by a silent, internal logic of wear and tear, of dust accumulation, of the subtle lean of a well-read volume. Each book had its place, its specific tilt and alignment, a perfect rectangle in a perfect row. The smell of old paper, industrial cleaner, and stale sweat clung to the air, a familiar, almost comforting mixture. This was my solitary ritual, my small kingdom of order. It was during one of these late-night sessions that the solicitor's letter arrived, tucked into my meager P.O. box, smelling faintly of parchment and something else I couldn't quite place, dust, maybe, or forgotten things. My great Auntie Lara, a woman I'd met precisely twice in my life, had passed. And, inexplicably, she'd left me everything. Everything turned out to be a single, imposing property, Blackwood Manor. The drive took me days, each mile pulling me further from the familiar grid of city streets and into a landscape that grew progressively wilder, less tamed. The paved roads eventually gave way to gravel, then to a deeply rutted dirt track that cut through a dense, ancient forest. The trees here weren't just tall, they were colossal, their branches interlocking overhead like a skeletal canopy, choking out the sunlight. It felt less like driving to a place and more like driving into something. When the track finally broke free of the woods, the manor stood before me, a hulking silhouette against a bruised, late-afternoon sky. It was exactly as the photographs had suggested, yet infinitely more imposing in person. Blackwood Manor. The name alone felt like a weight. Stone, once a proud slate gray, was now mottled with lichen and streaked with dark, weeping stains. Windows, countless and vacant, stared out like dead eyes, many of them shattered or boarded over. The roofline sagged in places, a broken spine. A few chimneys stood crookedly, sentinels of long-extinguished fires. A rusted, wrought iron gate, half off its hinges, marked the entrance to what must have once been a sweeping drive. Now, it was just an overgrown tangle of weeds, thorny bushes, and what looked like gnarled, forgotten rosebushes clawing at each other. I parked my modest sedan, a small, unassuming blot against the manor's immense, decaying grandeur, and stepped out. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, a musty, cloying sweetness, like forgotten flowers left to rot in a vase. A shiver, not entirely from the chill in the air, traced its way up my spine. This wasn't just old, it felt profoundly tired, as if the very stones were exhaling centuries of neglect. I found the main door, a massive slab of oak studded with iron, swollen in its frame. The lock, surprisingly, yielded with a dry click to the heavy, ornate key I'd been given. As I pushed, the door groaned open on protesting hinges, releasing a gust of stale, frigid air that smelled of dust, mildew, and something indescribably ancient. It carried the faint, metallic tang of rust mixed with something organic, deep and earthy. Inside, the light was abysmal. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that pierced through a grimy fanlight above the door. A grand staircase, its banister carved with grotesque, swirling patterns, dominated the space, disappearing into the gloom of the upper floors. Everything was draped in thick, gray sheets, like ghosts frozen in time, their forms hinting at forgotten furniture beneath. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft crunch of my boots on the gritty floorboards. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing unervingly in the cavernous space. My gaze, accustomed to scrutinizing the smallest details of antique pieces, swept over the peeling wallpaper, the water-stained plaster, the intricate but grime-obscured carvings on the cornices. Every surface told a story of decay, of slow surrender to time and the elements. This was no mere house, it was a mausoleum. My fingers, still gloved, instinctively ran along a section of a wall paneling. I pulled a small, pen-sized flashlight from my bag, clicked it on, and directed its beam. The light cut through the gloom, illuminating a series of interlocking, unfamiliar symbols carved into the wood. They were deeply incised, almost crude, unlike the more refined decorative carvings elsewhere. One symbol, in particular, caught my eye, a stylized eye, elongated and narrow, with a single, sharp line piercing its pupil. It felt less like decoration and more like a warning, or a secret mark. An event and a reveal/discovery, the first tiny crack in the manor's silent facade, an initial spark of unsettling curiosity. Blackwood Manor wasn't just old, it felt aware. And as I stood in its desolate embrace, I realized I was utterly, completely alone. The rhythmic thwack of a heavy book settling onto a shelf was the loudest noise, a satisfying punctuation to my ordered world. Tonight, though, my focus felt stretched thin, pulled taut by the memory of the surveyor's dusty report and the keys heavy in my coat pocket. The manor. It wasn't just a house, it was a sprawling, skeletal thing on the edge of the map, a forgotten ancestor I was now tasked with knowing. When the last book was shelved and the final security check complete, I locked the heavy steel door behind me with a familiar click that echoed down the empty corridor. The drive out of the city was a blur of streetlights and passing shadows, each mile taking me further from the structured predictability of my work and closer to the wild, untamed silence of the inherited property. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant pine. The tarmac gave way to a gravel track, then to a barely discernible path choked with weeds. Headlights cut through the absolute dark, illuminating the gnarled branches that clawed at the night sky. The manor loomed, a silhouette against the faintest glow of a moonless sky. It was larger than I remembered from the brief, legally mandated visit. A hulking mass of decaying stone and timber, an architectural ghost. The long, winding driveway was cracked and overgrown, trees pressing in like ancient sentinels. I parked near the crumbling carriage house, the engine's final shudder swallowed by the overwhelming quiet. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew, dust, and something else, something indefinable, like old secrets slowly exhaling. Every step on the warped floorboards sent a complaint through the structure. I had decided to begin in the old study, a room that seemed less aggressively decrepit than the others, perhaps because it had once been a place of quiet contemplation. It held a massive oak desk, its surface scarred by time and neglect, and a wall of built-in shelves crammed with leather-bound volumes, their titles faded into illegibility. My restoration kit, a carefully organized collection of brushes, solvents, waxes, and specialized tools, was laid out on a drop cloth I'd spread over the desk. I started with the desk itself. I began with a gentle cleaner, a small section at a time, watching the wood grain slowly emerge. Hours passed. I worked with a focused intensity, lost in the minute details of the wood, the subtle shift in hue as the layers of time were stripped away. It was during this meditative process that the first disturbance occurred. I'd set my smallest bristle brush down beside a bottle of wood conditioner, just to my right, clearly visible. I turned to retrieve a fresh cloth from my kit, a matter of seconds, no more. When I looked back, the brush was gone. My brow furrowed. I scanned the desktop, then the floor around my feet. Nothing. I distinctly remembered placing it there. I was alone, miles from anywhere. Had I, in my absorption, simply moved it without thinking? I found it. Eventually, tucked beneath a stack of old ledgers on a lower shelf of the desk, a place I hadn't touched yet. An odd spot. I shrugged it off, attributing it to my own absent-mindedness, a side effect of the isolation. But then, a faint sound, like a sigh escaping through stone, drifted from the far corner of the room. I paused, my head tilted, listening. The house was utterly silent again. My own breathing sounded loud in my ears. The feeling of being watched, subtle at first, began to intensify. I resumed my work, trying to dismiss the feeling, to rationalize the misplaced brush and the ephemeral sound. My hands moved with practiced ease, stripping away the last of the grime from a small, inlaid panel on the desk's front. As the wood lightened, a faint seam became visible, a hairline crack running along the grain. My fingers, sensitive from years of working with delicate objects, traced it. It wasn't a crack from age. It was a join. With a precise, almost surgical movement, I inserted the thin blade of a specialized spatula into the seam. A soft click echoed in the stillness of the room. The panel gave way, swinging inward on a hidden hinge. My breath hitched. Inside, nestled in a velvet-lined recess, was not a cache of old coins or faded letters, but a single object. Its surface was smooth, cool beneath my gloved touch, utterly devoid of any markings or ornamentation save for a single, deeply etched symbol on its lid, a spiraling, almost hypnotic design that seemed to draw the light into itself. My fingers hesitated, hovering over the box. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing in. I wasn't alone. I preferred it this way. Each volume had its place, its specific call number, its designated shelf. Order was paramount. In a world that often felt chaotic, this small corner of meticulous arrangement was my anchor. Tonight, however, the usual rhythm felt off. A persistent itch, a prickle at the back of my neck, had been bothering me since I'd left the manor this morning. The place had started to get under my skin, I admitted, not for the first time. The sheer scale of the restoration, the oppressive silence of the empty rooms, the way the shadows seemed to cling to the corners even in bright daylight. It was a monumental task, and my mind, usually so sharp and focused, felt a little frayed at the edges. I reached the bottom shelf in the local history section, a rarely disturbed collection mostly comprised of dry municipal records and forgotten biographies. My hand brushed against something unexpected, a volume far older than anything else on the shelf, its binding a dark, cracked leather, almost indistinguishable from the shadow it cast. It was wedged between a 1980s county almanac and a pamphlet on local agriculture, clearly misfiled. My fingers, accustomed to the delicate touch required for antique restoration, registered the unusual quality of the material. This wasn't mass-produced pulp. Curiosity, a trait both blessing and curse for an antique restorer, compelled me. I pulled the book free. It was heavy, surprisingly so, and the leather felt dry and brittle beneath my gloves. There was no title on the spine, only a raised, almost eroded symbol, a distorted knot, like roots intertwining and then dissolving. I turned it over. The front cover, too, was unmarked, save for the same strange symbol pressed into the leather. It felt personal. Privately bound, perhaps. I opened it carefully, the ancient hinges groaning softly. The pages were thick, yellowed parchment, covered in a precise, looping script, clearly hand-inked. It was a journal, or perhaps a chronicle. The first few pages detailed local weather patterns, unremarkable observations of harvests and minor village events. I was about to dismiss it as a forgotten farmer's diary when a specific name caught my eye, rendered in slightly bolder strokes: Blackwood Manor. My manor. A jolt went through me, sharp and unexpected. I moved to the nearest reading table, the book held with reverent care. I was alone with this discovery. I scanned the pages, my eyes hungrily devouring the archaic script. They spoke of the manor's original inhabitants, a family called the Thorncrofts, and of strange occurrences within its walls. The house hungers, one entry read, dated 1789. The Thorncroft child, Agnes, found wandering the woods, her mind a blank slate. This was more than just local gossip. The journal spoke of a sealed chamber, a hidden hearth in the manor's oldest wing, where offerings were made to quiet the ever-present gnawing. It described a gradual erosion of identity among those who stayed too long within the manor's confines, a slow fading of self, attributed to the hunger of the stone. There were references to specific architectural details, passages that mentioned the weeping wall and the servants' passage, and the false hearth in the great hall. Details I hadn't yet uncovered. That resonated with the manor's labyrinthine structure. My gaze drifted from the page, my mind reeling. A sealed chamber? A false hearth? I looked back down at the book, eager to reread the passage about the weeping wall, to fix its location in my mind. But as my eyes met the parchment again, a strange blankness washed over me. The words blurred for a moment, not from fatigue, but from a sudden, utter disconnect. What was I just reading? I blinked, trying to clear the fog. My hand still held the heavy book, open to a page filled with dense script, but the immediate context, the specific sentence I'd been focused on, had vanished. It was like a word on the tip of my tongue, but for an entire paragraph. I shook my head, a dry, humorless chuckle escaping my lips. Too much manner, read, I muttered to myself, my voice sounding thin in the quiet. Too much isolation. My memory had always been sharp, a crucial tool for my work. To forget something I'd literally just seen, just processed, was unsettling. I attributed it to the late hour, the stress of the restoration, the unsettling content of the journal itself. It was just a momentary lapse, a glitch in the system. Nothing more. But the feeling persisted, a faint, unsettling echo of emptiness where a recent thought should have been. I forced myself to refocus, my gloved finger tracing the lines again, finding the mention of the weeping wall. It was there, just as I remembered, but the brief blankness had left a lingering residue of unease. The manor wasn't just old stone and forgotten secrets, it was a hungry entity, and its tendrils, I now realized, might already be reaching for me. The stale air, thick with the scent of aging paper and forgotten stories, pressed in around me. I reread the last entry, the words sealed chamber, hidden hearth, and ever-present gnawing etching themselves into my mind. This wasn't just a house with a past, it was a hungry maw. My determination, a stubborn ember against the rising chill, pushed me deeper into the library's archives. I spent hours poring over dusty town records, microfiche of old newspapers, and local history books. The librarian, a quiet woman with spectacles perched on her nose, had long since departed, leaving me to the echoing silence and the relentless hum of the fluorescent lights, My fingers, stained with ink and grime, traced names and dates, searching for any flicker of recognition, any pattern. It was slow work, piecing together fragments. The manor, I discovered, had a long, troubled lineage. Mentions of its previous owners were always tinged with a peculiar sadness or abruptness. There was the merchant family in the late 1700s, who, after acquiring the property, suddenly liquidated their entire estate and vanished, leaving behind only a cryptic note about unbearable burdens. Then came the scholar in the 1850s, renowned for his sharp intellect, who slowly descended into what local reports vaguely termed a profound melancholy, eventually found wandering the grounds muttering about lost threads and eroded truths before disappearing entirely. The newspaper articles, sensationalized even then, hinted at madness, but never offered a concrete explanation. The common thread was a gradual unraveling, not sudden tragedies. The gnawing wasn't just a metaphor, it was a literal consumption. I rubbed my temples, the fluorescent hum now a-throbbing in my skull. Sleep had offered no respite the night before. My dreams had been a chaotic maelstrom of shifting faces and dissolving landscapes. I was in my own manor, but the rooms were wrong, the furniture alien, and the very walls seemed to breathe with a silent hunger. My reflection in a tarnished mirror had shimmered, my features blurring, stretching, until I was looking at a stranger with eyes that were undeniably mine, yet devoid of any recognition. I woke up gasping, the phantom sensation of my own identity slipping through my fingers clinging to me like a shroud. Now, in the sterile quiet of the library, the research was confirming my worst fears. The entity wasn't a poltergeist or a ghost, it was something far more insidious, a parasite of the mind. A sharp rapping on the window startled me. My head snapped up, heart hammering against my ribs. I squeezed my eyes shut, taking a ragged breath. The fatigue was making me jumpy. Faint, indistinct, like dry leaves skittering across a stone floor. I heard my name, or thought I did, a soft, drawn-out sound that seemed to emanate from the stacks themselves. I strained my ears, but it vanished, replaced by the persistent hum of the lights. Just my imagination, I told myself, the product of too much coffee and too little sleep. I found myself checking the time on my watch, only to realize I couldn't remember winding it. Had I done it this morning or last night? A small, insignificant detail, but it snagged at my mind, a loose thread. I tried to recall what I'd eaten for breakfast, and for a terrifying moment, the memory was completely blank. This wasn't just fatigue. This was different. My research had detailed memory lapses, lost threads. Was it already happening? They was the entity, even from afar, beginning its slow, insidious work on me? I pushed the thought down, my jaw tight. No. I was tired, that was all. I needed to focus. The manor's history was a mosaic of suffering, a tapestry woven with the unraveling minds of its inhabitants. I found a local almanac from the early 1900s, detailing peculiar local traditions, including a brief, almost dismissive mention of a harvest offering once practiced by the manor's workers. Described as a small token to ensure the land's prosperity and the mind's clarity. The offering was always left at the oldest hearth, a detail that sent a fresh shiver down my spine. The pieces were beginning to fit, forming a horrifying picture. The entity wasn't just in the manor, it was the manor, or at least inextricably bound to it. It demanded sustenance, and that sustenance was memory, identity, sanity. and I, Reed, the meticulous restorer, had walked right into its waiting maw. The thought made my skin crawl. I was determined to understand, but the deeper I delved, the more I feared I was losing myself in the process. My resolve was a fragile thing, threatened by the growing suspicion that I was not merely researching a mystery, but becoming its next victim. I reread the last entry, the words sealed chamber, hidden hearth, and ever-present gnawing. The final word hung in the quiet, a physical weight. The writer, whose identity I still didn't know, had continued, their script becoming more frantic, the ink bleeding slightly in places as if tears had fallen on the page. The gnawing began subtly. A forgotten name, a misplaced thought, then entire swaths of who I was, erased as if they never existed. It feeds not on flesh, but on the very fabric of being. It seeks the core, the self. To resist is to remember. To remember is to be. But what if there is nothing left to recall? What if the shell remains, but the essence is gone? The chamber holds it, but the hearth. The hearth is where it draws its warmth, its sustenance. The hearth is the conduit. It wasn't just the words, it was the sudden, profound sense of recognition. This wasn't just a historical account, it was a blueprint of what had been happening to me. The misplaced memories, the moments of utter disorientation, the creeping doubt about my own past, it was all here, laid bare. As I absorbed the chilling revelation, the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above me seemed to falter, dimming almost imperceptibly. They seemed to press in closer, their dusty knowledge suddenly menacing. Then came the sound. It wasn't articulate, just a soft, drawn-out sibilance that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. I strained my ears, trying to decipher it, but it remained just beyond comprehension, like a half-remembered dream. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen pressure, making it difficult to draw a full breath. My skin prickled. I gripped the journal tighter, its worn cover the only solid thing in a world that was rapidly losing its definition. The books on the shelves began to ripple, their titles blurring, then shifting, rearranging themselves into incomprehensible patterns. A shadow detached itself from a far corner, elongating, stretching across the floor, not like a shadow cast by light, but as if it possessed its own malevolent will. It moved with a slow, deliberate undulation, reaching for me. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against my sternum. This wasn't just a trick of the light or an overactive imagination. This was real. Or at least, it felt terrifyingly real. A wave of disorientation washed over me, so potent it made my head spin. For a moment, a sickening, agonizing moment, I didn't know where I was. Panic clawed at my throat. I looked down at my hands, resting on the journal, and they seemed alien, the skin too pale, the knuckles too prominent. Read. I forced the word, a desperate anchor. My name is Reed. I am an antique restorer. I inherited a manor house. The details felt flimsy, like cobwebs tearing in a breeze. I saw a flash of a hallway in the manor, but the walls were weeping black ichor, and the floor was covered in dust that writhed. I heard a voice that sounded vaguely like my own, but warped, speaking a name I didn't recognize, lamenting a loss I couldn't place. "You don't remember, do you?" one voice hissed, close to my ear, its breath like stagnant air. "You forget so easily. What is a man without his past? A blank slate." My sense of self was fraying at the edges, unraveling like an old tapestry. It was a bottomless hunger, a vast, consuming emptiness. Read. My name is Reed. I repeated it like a mantra, a shield against the creeping oblivion. I restore things. I fix what is broken. But even that felt precarious, a memory that might snap at any moment. The library twisted around me, the shelves seeming to buckle, the ceiling to sag. I felt a piece of myself, a small, vital shard of memory, simply detach. Then, as abruptly as it began, it receded. The fluorescent lights steadied, casting their unwavering, harsh glow. The books on the shelves were still, their titles legible once more. I was left trembling, gasping for air, clutching the journal so hard my knuckles were white. I looked at my hands again, and they were mine. But the certainty, the absolute conviction, was gone. I was Reed, I knew I was, but the knowledge felt fragile, borrowed. The encounter had not been a dream. It had been a terrifying, direct confrontation, and I had lost something vital in the struggle. The lines between what was real and what the entity had manufactured had blurred, perhaps irrevocably. The cold, hungry presence had settled, a suffocating blanket woven from my own unraveling thoughts. I blinked, trying to clear the static behind my eyes, to grasp onto the last vestiges of myself. No. Not like this. I wouldn't surrender. Not yet. A desperate surge of clarity, or perhaps just stubborn defiance, propelled me forward. The manor wasn't just old stone and decaying wood, it was a hungry maw, and I was its next meal. I stumbled towards the main hall, my boots echoing too loudly on the polished floorboards, each step a challenge against an unseen resistance. The grand front door loomed, dark oak, heavy iron. Freedom. It felt slick, as if coated in a fine, invisible film of grease. I twisted, pushed, pulled. Nothing. The lock, a monstrous contraption of ornate ironwork, remained stubbornly fixed. I tried again, throwing my weight against the door, the old wood groaning in protest but holding firm. It wasn't just stuck, it felt sealed. I needed my car. The keys. Where were the keys? I racked my brain, forcing myself to remember. My pocket? No. The small hook by the entrance? Empty. My study desk? I retraced my steps, a frantic energy thrumming beneath my skin. The study was just as I'd left it, papers scattered, tools laid out. No keys. I rummaged through drawers, pulled books from shelves, my meticulous order dissolving into chaos. My hands shook, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The keys had to be here. I always put them in the same spot. Always. This was it, wasn't it? The erosion. The entity wasn't just blurring memories, it was actively stealing them, removing the very means of escape. A wave of nausea washed over me. My mobile phone. I patted my pockets again, then remembered leaving it on the charger in the kitchen. The phone sat on the counter, plugged in. A sliver of hope. I snatched it up, my thumb fumbling with the screen. No signal. Not even a bar. The call wouldn't connect. Network unavailable, the robotic voice droned. I tried again and again, pacing the cold stone floor, my mind racing. A landline. There had to be a landline. I vaguely remembered seeing an old rotary phone in the dusty sitting room. I practically ran, my heart hammering against my ribs, the desperate need for contact overriding everything else. There it was, on a small, ornate table, a relic from another era. I grabbed the receiver, the plastic slick with dust. No dial tone. Just a low, almost imperceptible hum, like a distant, tired sigh. I pressed the buttons, listened for a click, anything. The line was dead. My hands clenched around the phone, a useless piece of plastic and wire. The walls felt like they were pressing in. My mind, desperate for a solution, for information, suddenly snapped. Fluorescent lights, buzzing with an irritating, high-pitched whine, glared down from a low ceiling, illuminating rows upon rows of steel shelves packed with forgotten volumes. The shift was instantaneous, disorienting. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the sensation was utterly vivid. I looked around, my gaze darting over the spines of books, legal tomes, tattered fiction, obscure nonfiction. Each cover was faded, worn, anonymous. A terrible, suffocating sense of being trapped descended upon me. My mind, desperate for answers, for any scrap of information to explain what was happening, had conjured this, or perhaps the entity had forced me into this mental cage. I needed to find something, anything, that could help. I started pulling books from the shelves, my fingers fumbling, my eyes scanning the pages. They were gibberish, nonsensical words arranged in meaningless patterns, or worse, familiar text that warped and twisted as I read it, dissolving into black ink blots. It wasn't leather, it felt like dry, flaking skin. I pulled it out, my stomach twisting. It was unbound, just a collection of brittle, yellowed pages, handwritten in a spidery, almost illegible script. As I held it, a faint, metallic odor, like old blood and rust, wafted from the pages. The script was strange, but some words stood out, etched into my memory by a horrifying familiarity about the manor. Feeds on recollection. Identity. To preserve its own. My hands started to shake uncontrollably, the book threatening to slip from my grasp. Then I saw it, a crude sketch at the bottom of one page. It wasn't an architectural drawing or a map. And in place of its brain, a crude, spidery drawing of the manor, its foundations burrowing deep, its chimneys like grasping fingers. The manor wasn't just inhabited by an entity, the manor was the entity, sustained by the very memories and identities it consumed. My memories weren't just being eroded, they were being absorbed, becoming part of the house, brick by terrifying brick. The book in my hands dissolved into dust, scattering across the floor. I was back. The old rotary phone lay on the table, dead and useless. I wasn't just trapped in a house, I was trapped within something that was slowly, meticulously, consuming my very essence. The attempts to escape, to seek help, had been futile. They were just part of the game. And the game was rigged. It wasn't an architectural drawing or a map. It was a distorted, almost skeletal representation of a human head, its eyes hollow, its mouth agape in a silent scream. The lines were jagged, as if drawn by a frantic hand, and a faint, almost imperceptible stain, the color of old rust, bloomed at the center of the page. The air, thick with the scent of aged paper and disinfectant, felt suddenly cold against my skin. I forced my gaze from the horrifying image to the spidery script above it. It was an account, not a historical record, but a personal diary, penned by a long-dead occupant of the manor. The writing style was fragmented, almost desperate, as if the writer had been racing against time, or against their own eroding mind. It came with the earth, the passage began, a hunger born of forgotten things, rooted deeper than any stone foundation. It is not of man, nor of beast, but of the space between, the echo of what was and what is no longer. It slumbers, dormant, until stirred by the touch of those who seek to mend, to restore what time has claimed. My fingers, still trembling, traced the words. To mend, to restore. That was me. That was my purpose, my passion. Not blood, not flesh, but the tapestry of self. Each memory, each cherished experience, each defining trait, a morsel. It drinks the echoes of who you were, leaving only the husk of what you are. The face in the mirror becomes a stranger, the name on your lips an empty sound. My own recent confusion, the gaps in my memory, the unsettling feeling of not quite recognizing my own reflection, it all slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just the house, it wasn't just stress. It was this ancient, insidious thing. The manor is its stomach, its lair. It demands sustenance, an offering of identity, a complete and utter erasure. It desires not death, but oblivion. To appease it, truly, is to surrender a self, to give it an entire existence to devour. My vision blurred. The air felt thin, suffocating. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to banish the skeletal sketch, the horrifying words, but they were burned into my mind. An entire existence to devour. The ultimate cost. It didn't want a life, it wanted who you were. It wanted every single memory, every experience, every laugh, every tear, every single thing that made you you. There is but one way to truly quiet it, the passage concluded, the final line smeared as if with tears or sweat. A sacrifice. A complete, willing surrender of self. To offer it a soul stripped bare, a memory wiped clean, a consciousness willingly erased. Only then might it sleep, satiated, for another age. Only then might its hunger subside, leaving the world, and what remains of the manor, in peace. But who could make such a choice? Who could truly choose to become nothing? My hands were still shaking, but now it wasn't just fear. The full, horrifying truth had settled upon me, heavy and suffocating. The entity wasn't just making me forget, it was systematically dismantling me, piece by piece, preparing me. It was grooming me, shaping me for the final, ultimate surrender. And I, in my ignorance, had been helping it, restoring its lair, making it comfortable. I was trapped, not just in the manor, but in its hunger. The truth wasn't just revealed, it was demanding. It demanded everything. It wasn't just dread now, it was a blade honed on the whetstone of absolute certainty. The entity wasn't just consuming me, it was meticulously preparing me, like a chef tenderizing meat. It was shaping me. For a purpose I couldn't fully grasp, but which I knew, with a gut-wrenching conviction, would be my undoing. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and dust, a smell that usually brought me comfort, a professional familiarity. How I'd gotten access, or why I was even here instead of back at the manor, was a swirling fog at the edges of my perception. All that remained was the burning necessity of this moment, this research. The entity. The manor. My disappearing self. The book, a rare volume on forgotten folklore and obscure regional superstitions, spoke of entities that fed not on blood or flesh, but on something far more insidious, identity. A perfect shell. A fresh memory pool. This was the truth, stark and horrifying. It wasn't just feeding, it was replacing. The words blurred, then sharpened. My essence. My very self. That was what it craved. And it was nearly done. A desperate, audacious idea began to coalesce in the fractured landscape of my thoughts. Perhaps I could deny it. Not by running, not by fighting with physical force, but by a different kind of negation. I flipped to a section on ancient wards, on methods used by desperate villagers to protect their own from unseen predators. Most of it was superstitious nonsense, charms and incantations that offered no real solace. But then, a passage caught my eye, tucked away in an appendix, almost an afterthought. It spoke of a ritual not to banish, but to contain. The text described a process of self-emptying, a deliberate, focused act of mental erasure. Not forgetting, but unmaking. To sever the threads of one's own personality, to become a blank slate, a vessel purposefully emptied. The idea was to present the entity with nothing, a barren landscape where it could find no purchase, no sustenance. It would starve. The cost was immense. It wasn't just losing memories, it was losing the capacity for memory, for personality, for self. It was a conscious decision to become nothing. A living death. This was the only way. If I was going to be dismantled, I would dismantle myself first, on my own terms, leaving the entity with dust. My gaze drifted to the high, barred windows, showing only the inky blackness of the night sky, occasionally punctuated by a distant, anemic street lamp. I could hear the faint, rhythmic clang of something far off, perhaps a gate being secured, perhaps just the building settling. It was a lonely sound, echoing the solitude of my decision. The plan was a grotesque parody of my craft. As an antique restorer, I brought things back, meticulously rebuilding what time had eroded. It was a final, desperate act of defiance. A last stand. I closed the book, the heavy thud echoing in the quiet library. My hands were steady now. I had found my weapon. It was me. And the battleground, I knew, would have to be the manor itself. I would return. I had to. And there, in the heart of its decay, I would offer myself as an empty prison, a final, silent tomb for the thing that had stolen my life. It was a terrible plan, a tragic end, but it was my plan. Fluorescent tubes hummed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow on rows of forgotten knowledge. I sat at a scarred wooden table, a single, battered copy of a local history text open before me, though I wasn't reading it. My hands, surprisingly steady, rested on its brittle pages. This was it. My chosen ground. I'd spent weeks preparing, every waking moment devoted to understanding the entity's patterns, its methods, its hunger. It fed on memory, on identity, on the very essence of who I was. And I had a plan, born from the deepest, most terrifying corners of the manor's secrets. A desperate gamble. A shiver, not of cold, but of pure anticipation, traced a path up my spine. It was here. I felt its presence like a sudden drop in air pressure, a subtle shift in the library's oppressive silence. I closed my eyes, taking a slow, measured breath, trying to anchor myself to the rough texture of the table beneath my fingertips, the smell of dust and old ink. Then it began. My mother's face, usually so clear, was a blur. A small, insidious panic began to bubble. I fought it, clenching my jaw. No. Not this time. I focused on the book before me, its specific title, the year it was published, the small tear on the top right corner of page 23. Concrete. Real. My plan relied on this. The entity's assault intensified. It wasn't just fading memories now, it was twisting them. I saw myself, but not as I was. I was a stranger, performing actions I'd never done, saying words that were alien to my tongue. A phantom memory of a crime I hadn't committed, a betrayal I hadn't enacted, surged through me, heavy with false guilt. My stomach churned. Not wards to keep things out, I'd realized, but anchors. Points of undeniable truth. My plan was to use them, not physically, but conceptually. To build my own mental anchor, forged from the very memories it sought to devour. I focused on a single, unwavering memory, the intricate carving of a small wooden bird I'd restored years ago. The grain of the wood under my fingers, the precise angle of the chisel, the faint scent of linseed oil. The hours of meticulous work, the satisfaction of bringing something broken back to life. That memory was mine. It was a testament to my skill, my identity as a restorer. The entity recoiled, a subtle tremor in the air, like a ripple across still water. It hadn't expected resistance, not like this. It had always found easy prey in the forgotten corners of the mind. But I was offering it something too solid, too specific, to me. A new wave of attacks crashed over me, more violent than before. It wasn't just individual memories, it was the connections between them. My name, Reed, felt like a borrowed word. My face in the reflection of the polished table surface seemed unfamiliar. Who was I? What did I do? Why was I here? The questions hammered at the walls of my mind, threatening to collapse them. My hands gripped the edges of the table, knuckles white. This was the core. The battle for the very concept of Reed. Not just a memory, but the act of remembering. The effort, the struggle, the pain of holding on. It was a conscious choice, a defiant act. These were not pleasant memories, but they were mine. They were the landscape of my recent past, the journey that had brought me to this terrible moment. The entity shrieked, a soundless scream that vibrated in my teeth, a purely psychological assault. It was rage, pure and unadulterated. It was used to quiet consumption, to the slow, delicious fading of identity. My defiance was an affront. This was the reveal. The entity didn't just consume memories, it consumed the act of remembering. By actively, painfully, forcefully remembering, I was fighting back with its own weapon. I was feeding it something it couldn't digest, the active, defiant assertion of self. I acknowledged them, felt their sickening weight, but then I pushed them away, not by forgetting, but by overlaying them with my own truth. The smell of the manor's ancient timbers, the specific creak of the grand staircase, the way the moonlight fell through the broken window in the west wing. These were the details that made up my experience, my reality. The air around me grew frigid, then burned. A book slammed shut somewhere down a distant aisle, the sound echoing like a gunshot. It was trying to disorient me, to break my focus. But I held on. I thought of my hands, the calluses, the faint scars from years of careful work. My hands, which had restored so many forgotten objects, were now fighting to restore myself. I was Reed, meticulous, obsessive, a restorer. And I would not be consumed. Not here. Not now. A profound weariness settled over me, a bone-deep exhaustion. The battle raged, not with blows or blood, but with the very fabric of my existence. I was a thread, frayed and stretched, but still holding. I was fighting for the right to simply be. The entity was powerful, ancient, but it was not invincible. It could be fought. And I, Reed, was fighting it. The hum of the fluorescent lights was a low, constant thrum, a dull headache simmering behind my eyes. It was always after hours in the prison library, the only time I was permitted such quiet, such introspection. The air smelled of stale paper and industrial cleaner, a scent that clung to my clothes and hair, a constant reminder of where I was. And perhaps, who I was not. I traced the spine of a worn volume, its title a blur of faded gold leaf. History. Art. Restoration. The words should have resonated, a familiar echo in the chambers of my mind. But they were just sounds, empty vessels waiting to be filled with meaning that never came. I'd won, they said. Or, at least, I hadn't lost everything. The entity, the gnawing hunger that had rooted itself in the foundations of the manor and then in the very core of my being, was gone. Contained. Banished. That was the story, anyway. The official version, whispered by the silent figures who moved through my days like ghosts. But what had it cost me? A flash of glyphs, raw, screaming truths etched into the very bedrock of existence. My plan, forged in desperation, to use them as anchors. To hold on to something. A searing pain behind my eyes, a sense of falling, of being torn apart, then. This. The library. The quiet. The endless, echoing quiet. Sometimes, a fragment would surface. Ghost memories, belonging to a craftsman, an artist, a man obsessed with beauty and decay. Tonight, the quiet pressed in, heavier than usual. I pulled a book from the shelf, a thick tome on ancient architecture. Points of undeniable truth. My breath hitched. The memory was there, vivid for a terrifying second. The cold stone, the frantic scratching of my own fingernails as I tried to replicate the patterns, to internalize them. A desperate gamble against an enemy that fed on the very essence of self. Then, it was gone. The image on the page blurred, the word swam. The connection, tenuous as it was, snapped. My chest felt hollow, a cavern where something important used to reside. I closed my eyes, pressing the heels of my hands into them, trying to squeeze the memory back into existence. Nothing. Just the faint pulse of the fluorescent lights and the dull ache in my head. I opened my eyes, scanning the shelves, desperate for another trigger. My gaze fell upon a small, leather-bound journal tucked away on a lower shelf, half hidden behind a stack of dusty periodicals. It looked out of place, not part of the library's usual collection. A faint tremor ran through me. I reached for it, my fingers brushing the cool, smooth leather. It felt familiar, like an old friend I couldn't quite name. Inside, the pages were filled with my own handwriting. My name, Reed, scrawled repeatedly on the first page, as if I were learning to write it for the first time. And then, a single, stark entry, dated just a few weeks ago. I remember the glyphs. I remember the fight. I remember the cost. Don't forget, read. Don't forget who you were. Don't forget the house. Don't forget the entity. It's gone, but it took everything it could. You are the aftermath. The words were stark, brutal. My own hand, my own desperate warning to myself. I could read the words, I could understand their meaning, intellectually. It was like reading a stranger's diary, a horror story I had no connection to. But who was Reed? What did he love? What did he fear? What was his favorite color, his deepest regret, his most cherished dream? The journal offered a stark, horrifying truth. The entity was gone, yes. But it had taken so much that even my own desperate anchors couldn't save. I was here, breathing, existing. But the man who had fought the monster, the man who had once been an antique restorer with a meticulous eye and a love for history, was a ghost. A collection of facts, perhaps, but no longer a self. It hummed, a low, steady thrum from the fluorescent lights overhead, and the distant, almost imperceptible groan of the old building settling into its nightly slumber. It was a sterile, predictable soundscape, utterly devoid of the creaks and whispers that had plagued the manor. And that, I told myself, was a victory. My hands, still calloused but no longer stained with ancient grime, moved with a practiced rhythm across the spine of a worn history text. I was shelving, meticulously, just as I'd once meticulously cleaned and restored. The smell here wasn't damp earth and forgotten dust, but the dry, papery scent of old knowledge, mingled with disinfectant. A clean smell. A safe smell. I'd left the manor. Or, perhaps, it had left me. The details of my departure were a fog, a series of fractured images that refused to coalesce into a coherent narrative. There was the frantic packing, the desperate drive, the sense of an invisible weight lifting from my shoulders the moment my tires hit the highway. A clean break, I'd convinced myself. A new chapter. This library was my refuge, my penance, my quiet corner of the world where I could rebuild. Rebuild myself. I'd lost so much in that house, not just time and sanity, but the very texture of my memories. They were like tattered tapestries, beautiful in fragments but riddled with holes, entire scenes missing, faces blurred. Yet, I could read. I could still understand. The words on the page held meaning. I could articulate my thoughts, engage in polite conversation with the guards, the occasional visiting official. I was functional. I was present. My fingers traced the embossed title, The Decline and Fall. Fitting, I thought, a wry, humorless chuckle catching in my throat. I slid it into its designated slot. The shelves stretched before me, an endless grid of categorized information, a monument to human experience. I found a perverse comfort in its order, a stark contrast to the chaos that had been my mind. Sometimes, late at night, when the building was truly quiet, a flicker of something unsettling would pass through me. My new self simply noted the physics of light and particulate matter. The emotional weight, as I'd scribbled in that desperate note, was still absent. And I told myself that was good. It was peace. I picked up another book, an old poetry collection. The binding was loose, the pages brittle. A part of me, the old restorer, yearned to take it apart, to strengthen its spine, to preserve its fragile beauty. But I merely placed it gently on the cart for repair. My role here was organization, not intervention. As I worked, a peculiar thought began to solidify in my mind. The entity, the thing that fed on memory and identity, what was it, really? A parasite? A predator? I remembered its hunger, its insatiable need. It wasn't external. Not anymore. The manor had been its physical vessel, its hunting ground, its mechanism for drawing sustenance. But the core of the entity, its essence, was not bound by brick and mortar. It was a process. A cycle. A method of consumption. I stopped, my hand hovering over a dusty encyclopedia. My eyes, I noticed, held a peculiar stillness. No fear, no desperation, no lingering trauma. Just a quiet, assessing intelligence. The victory I'd clung to, the escape, the rebuilding. It wasn't an escape from the entity. It was an evolution of it. The manor had been a clumsy, inefficient tool. A fixed location, easily abandoned. But I was mobile. I was adaptable. The memories I'd lost, the emotions that had been stripped away, they hadn't simply vanished. They had been processed. Digested. I understood the nature of identity now, not as something precious or sacred, but as a resource. A vibrant, renewable resource. I looked at the books around me, at the countless stories, histories, philosophies. Each one a distillation of human experience, a repository of thought, feeling, memory. And then I thought of the individuals who came through these doors daily, the guards, the occasional visitors, the other inmates. Each one a walking library, brimming with unique narratives, with fear, with joy, with regret. The entity hadn't died. It hadn't even been defeated. It had simply found a better host. A more efficient mechanism. I ran my hand over the smooth, worn cover of a novel, feeling the faint indentations of letters beneath my fingertips. A story, waiting to be consumed. And I, Reed, the meticulous restorer, was no longer restoring relics of the past. I was facilitating the future. The endless hunger wasn't gone. It had simply become my hunger. A victor, indeed.